Is this art? I think we would probably all agree that this is an example of art. And what about this? I'm pretty sure when you hear the term art history, this is the kind of artwork that you think of. But what about this? This is a Mixtec skull from Tomb 7 in Monte Alban, Oaxaca, Mexico. This skull has been covered in turquoise. It also was inlaid with shell and obsidian to create the eyes and the teeth. But it's an actual human skull that was sort of maybe turned into a work of art. Now, arguably, the people who created this object did not go into making it thinking about this is an art object. Instead, this was likely produced for a funeral ritual. So do you call this art? And what about this? We've got a banana taped to a wall. Is this art? Is this conceptual art? I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and I'm an art historian, and this is Art Trippin Lecture Series. Hi, I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and this is Art Trippin. Welcome to Introduction to Art History, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to define art. What is art? Now, when you look at something like this painting by Lavinia Fontana, this might be sort of what you think of when you think of an artwork. But what about this Mixtec skull? An object like this was originally intended for a tomb, not a museum. But we look at it now in a museum and we think about it in maybe a different way than its original creators thought about it. And the interesting thing about objects like this is that in some cases, and in the case of Los Angeles, California, in the United States where I reside, these kinds of objects used to reside in the Natural History Museum. So that's like the museum with the dinosaur fossils and that kind of stuff, and like taxidermied animals. And in the last several decades, the way we think about these objects has changed. And this led to a really big change in Los Angeles, that this collection of ancient indigenous objects from Mexico and Central America were brought from, or like donated or deaccessioned from the Natural History Museum and donated or transferred over and given to the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, where this huge, vast collection of ancient indigenous objects now resides. And now we think about these objects as art objects. So nothing changed about the object. It's the way that we think about the objects that has changed. So I want you to be thinking about sort of what is the definition of art. Is this Mixtec skull an artwork, or is it an artifact? Or is it maybe both? Can it be both at once? So what about this? This is a ceramic vase by the ancient Mediterranean culture that we call the Minoans, an ancient people that lived even way before the ancient Greeks on the island of Crete in modern day Greece. Or what about this? This is a prayer rug. These objects have a utilitarian purpose. That means they're useful objects. So the vase would store some kind of liquid. The rug would be used to kneel on during prayer. However, we might also consider them art. Now, this is depending on who you ask. So if you ask an art historian maybe 50 years ago, they might not call these objects art, but I do. So you have to think about the history of the discipline of art history. Art history in and of itself is a very Western European kind of Eurocentric discipline. It's something that only came about in the 1800s, making it sort of a relatively young discipline in the academic sense. And it was something that was sort of started by Europeans who wanted to classify and kind of preserve and understand the history of the visual creation of Western European culture, and eventually now art history is a very global field. But if you ask an art historian from 50 years ago or 200 years ago, they would say that art is drawing, painting, and sculpture. And there would even be a hierarchy that defines which kind of art is better or more valuable or more important, and which is less important and less valuable. And so this is a very hierarchical system that was set up to define art. And maybe those old rules don't really work for us anymore. In that traditional, more conservative definition of art, you would have history painting at the top of the pyramid. So this is when you might see something like Jacques-Louis David's Oath of the Horatii. And then lower down, less important, would be something like Rachel Rush, the Dutch Baroque artist who painted this still life. And you will notice women have been traditionally excluded, and women were excluded from history painting because it required the study of the live nude body, and women were not permitted to do this. In the Baroque period, for example, women were allowed to paint landscapes and still life paintings. And of course, these have been relegated to a lesser importance. We also see that with objects like a ceramic vase or a prayer rug, or even this object that is behind me that we call textile art. This is a Oaxacan textile artwork. So again, let's go back to that traditional conservative art historian. If we ask that old guy, he might say something like a ceramic vase or a rug or textile art is actually not art, and he might call it craft. Craft is something that requires skill to make. Not just anybody can make these objects, but they're considered in the traditional Western art historical view less valuable. Now, in this class, we are throwing that trash out the door. That is not how we think in this class. We have a much more inclusive definition of art that includes utilitarian objects, things that are deemed traditionally craft. We will also include street art, conceptual art. Another term like craft that you might hear used is folk art. Folk art is a term that, again, those traditional Western European old white man definition of art history is going to say that folk art is an artwork that is made by someone that is not trained in an arts institution. So basically, if I wake up and start making art and I've never went to art school, I would be called a folk artist. And this term is used a lot of times to apply to artwork from artists who are living outside of Western Europe, basically. It's a term that's applied to a lot of indigenous arts from places like Africa, Asia, Latin America, etc. And there's another term, maybe similar to folk art, that is often used when talking about contemporary artists, especially modern and contemporary artists, that refers to, again, an artist who is not trained at an arts institution. So you might see this term outsider art. So there's an artist, Martin Ramirez, who's a great example of this. This artist lived much of his life in a psychiatric institution, so he did not attend art school, but he created so much stunning artwork throughout his life. So we also call these artists outsider artists. This might be a term that you will come across as you're learning more about art. We might also talk about conceptual art. So, for example, the Chicano conceptual collective called ASCO, or we might talk about street art. So, for example, Banksy. Now, if you ask that old conservative guy about his definition of art, he's going to say that Eurocentric perspective is going to say painting, drawing, and sculpture. And this other stuff is going to be relegated to these other terms like folk art and outsider art. But in this series, we are going to be talking about all of these kinds of arts. So I believe all of this falls under this umbrella term of the visual arts. And I don't believe in those traditional hierarchies. I don't think that a painting is by definition any better than a ceramic vase, for example. So in this series, we will have an inclusive definition of art that includes utilitarian objects, perhaps even ritualistic objects, as well as sort of traditional drawing and painting. We are going to look at it all. So we have a more open definition of art in this series. As we move forward, I want you to think about your definition of art. How would you define art? Where are the boundaries between art and life? And just for a moment, let that question stay open. You don't necessarily have to answer it yet. Let it marinate. Another thing I want to clarify is that in this series, we will be talking about the visual arts. Of course, I do appreciate the culinary arts, and I believe that fashion, music, and design are art forms. But in this class, we are looking at visual arts, so art forms that are primarily visual. So now we're going to look at these objects. One other thing I want to clarify is that where do we keep these objects that we call art? Well, obviously you might have art in your home like I do. I have this Oaxacan textile piece behind me. But in general, you're going to find art in two major spaces. These are museums and galleries. And sometimes people don't understand the difference between these two. So I always use this metaphor. You can think of a museum is kind of like a library. And a gallery is kind of more like a bookstore. So what does this mean? A museum is charged with preserving artworks, presenting them for display, and sometimes, carrying out conservation projects to keep these objects in shape and visible for not only the general public, but also for future generations. So a museum is really a place where art is preserved and displayed. Now, if you think about an art gallery is a place where generally contemporary artists are able to have their work featured and sold. So the purpose of an art gallery is really more to sell artwork, kind of like a bookstore. So as we embark on this journey together to discover art history, I want you to keep some of these questions in mind. What is art? What is the value of art? How do we define it? Where is the boundary between art and life? And what is the purpose of art? So this is what we're going to be talking about next. In my next video, I will discuss what art is for. What is the purpose of art? I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and this has been the Art Trippin lecture series. If you like this video, like, subscribe, comment below if you have any questions, and let me know what else you want to see.